to turn to the book of Galatians, chapter 2, verse 20. Very familiar verse, one that I've preached from many times. Galatians 2, verse 20. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. In this verse, Paul is intensely personal, speaks in first person, using the pronouns I 5 times, and me 3 times. And what we read here is his personal testimony, the life that he lived as a saved man. It's not the life that he always lived, but the life that he lived as a saved individual. And such should be descriptive of our life as well. He spoke in verse 19 of living unto God, living life in the direction of God. And here in verse 20 he says 3 times, I live. He says, I live, I now live, I live. 3 times. So he's writing, obviously, about living life. And what he says is not his idea or philosophy, but it's what he received from the Lord. We see that in chapter 1, verse 12, concerning the whole book. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. So he's testifying of what he has learned from the Lord. It's been imparted to him from the Lord. It's a part of his being. It's who he is. So what we read here is really like an open window into the heart and mind of Paul concerning the way and the manner in which he lived his life. It is a God-imparted method of living. So what we read here is a presentation. It's a summation of the Christian life. It defines Christianity. And we want to develop the thought from the phrase, the life which I now live. Which I now live. And that's our subject, life now. Life now. The life that we live now ought to be drastically different from our former life before salvation. And the life that is presented in our text is a life for now. It's for now. Regardless of now, what is being described here is for now. Not sometime in the future. Not something we used to do, but for now. So let's consider, first of all, the setting of this text. From chapter 1, verse 2, Paul's writing unto the churches of Galatia. Galatia, of course, was not a city. Galatia was a region in the Roman Empire in which there were many cities. We learn from the book of Acts that these churches were located in the cities that Paul and Barnabas visited during the first missionary journey, such as Antioch. There was a church there. Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. There were churches in these places. And Paul is writing to these churches. He's writing upon hearing that false teachers who were Judaizers, false teachers with their theology of works-based salvation and works-based righteousness, were now very prevalent in the region and had influence in the churches as well. These Judaizers based their entire system of teaching upon the false premise that God justified man as a result of man's godliness or works. In other words, if you qualify by your works, then the grace of God was extended to you. That same premise continues to exist today in various forms, even in our own circles, in various forms of so-called Christianity. These false teachers, these Judaizers, were demanding that these saved Galatians observe Jewish law in order to receive full blessing from God, insisting that they submit to circumcision and other outward religious requirements. And many of the saved Galatians had fallen prey to this, many in the churches. And for them, life had simply become an observance of laws and rites and ceremonies. Life was no longer about Christ. He was removed to the background. Life was now all about religious procedure, steps, and formulas. No longer about Christ. And this was spreading through the churches in the region of Galatia. So much so that Paul wrote in Galatians 1 verse 6, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from Him that called you unto the grace of Christ unto another gospel. Notice those words, removed from Him. They were living life removed from Him. It wasn't an outright rejection of the person of Christ, but it was a disconnect from Him. So Paul writes this letter upon hearing of this very disturbing report that they had moved away from Christ, obeying not the truth. And they had returned to a works-based righteousness. And we see that, notice in Galatians 3, verses 1 and 2, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth crucified among you? This only would I learn of you. Received ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? So they were returning to a mere form of religious life. They still professed Christ. It wasn't that they were denying Christ. They still professed Christ, but life was no longer about Christ. Life was more about do's and don'ts. They had been removed from Christ. Again, they still professed Christ, but it was mere surface. He wasn't the substance. They were striving to keep the law in order to be righteous, in order to be justified before God. And Paul addresses that there in Galatians 3. He addresses it again in Galatians 5 and verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And then in verse 4, Christ is become of no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified or made just by doing, by the law. Ye are fallen from grace. Not that they had lost their salvation, they had fallen from the theology of grace. And they were now entered into a works-based righteousness. And again, the reason for all of this is they were removed from Him. They were removed from Him. All the misery of removed from Him. From chapter 5, verse 4, the felt impression of Christ upon their lives was no longer. It was no longer. From chapter 5, verse 7, their lives were hindered by others. The reason? They were removed from Him. Chapter 5, verses 14 and 15, they couldn't get along with one another. The reason? They were removed from Him. Chapter 6, verse 7, their lives were deceived by sin. Again, the reason? Removed from Him. So you see, being removed from Him, He was no longer the emphasis of their life. He was no longer the reason. They brought trouble, they brought chaos, they brought dysfunction into their lives. From chapter 6, verse 12, their lives were reduced to a mere outward show and display. And this all for the sake of convenience. And that's what a works-based righteousness does. We see from all of this, because of removed from Him, their lives were an upheaval. So Paul writes this letter to correct the falsehood that many of the Galatian believers had fallen prey to. That being a works-based righteousness. Meaning that people are spiritual because of what they do or don't do. Or because of the group that they belong to. The Judaizers are saying, you belong to us, you're spiritual. And Paul is stressing throughout this letter that the truly spiritual will live a peculiar life, not to be spiritual, but because they are spiritual. He's stressing that they ought to live a particular life, not to be justified in the sight of God, but because they are justified in the sight of God. He's stressing that true spirituality will make a difference in the life lived. The life lived is not what gives spirituality. In other words, the life lived is not what makes you spiritual. But there is a life that springs from spirituality. He's saying true spirituality will make a difference in the life that you live. And he stresses this throughout the letter. Works do not provide a single element of salvation. They are not the source, they are not the cause, but salvation apart from works does produce works. That's the teaching of the book of Galatians. So Paul is rebuking throughout the letter the false teaching that had crept into the Galatian churches. And he's exhorting throughout the letter that these Galatian believers that made up the assemblies in that region, he's exhorting them, he's encouraging them to live a life that results from salvation. And our text, Galatians 2 verse 20, is a part of Paul's rebuke. He is rebuking from the standpoint of the life he lives. He's exhorting them. He's giving encouragement. And Galatians 2 verse 20 is a part of all of that. So throughout the letter, Paul in many ways is explaining Christianity. What it means to be a Christian. And here in Galatians 2:20 he gives his own testimony of his manner of life. And what he describes is in contrast to the lives of many of these Galatian believers. And sadly, in direct contrast to the lives that many professing Christians are living. So let's look at the life that Paul describes. The root problem for these Galatians is stated again in chapter 1 verse 6. Removed from Him. That's the root problem. Saved and living apart from Christ. That's a problem. The root problem. Removed from Him. Saved and living disconnected from Christ. So in rebuke to them, Paul states by way of personal testimony what life should be for the saved individual. And he says it ought to be a life connected to Christ. Again, remember, removed from Him. That's the root problem. And now Paul is saying, Galatians 2:20, that the Christian life is a life connected to Christ. Again, he uses the personal pronoun 5 times. Personal pronoun me 3 times. He speaks of Christ, referring to Him as Christ twice, the Son of God 1 time, and by personal pronouns, who and Himself. So what he's doing here is he speaks of Himself and Christ, but not separately, not independent from each other, but as connected and linked together. So Galatians 2:20 becomes a rebuke of removed from Christ. Notice, here in Galatians 2:20, he says, I am crucified with Christ. Notice also, Christ liveth in me. And notice also, Himself for me. The prepositions are very important. It is I with Christ, Christ in me, Himself for me. So he's speaking of Himself in Christ, has won. Again, a rebuke of the root problem removed from Christ. So the life that Paul is describing is linked inseparably to Christ. It is in relation and association with Christ. It corresponds to Christ. It is parallel to Christ. It is identified with Christ. These Galatians were living removed from Him. Paul is describing a life that is embedded to Christ. A life that is fixed and settled in Christ. In that phrase, I am crucified with Christ, he's declaring that Christ's sufferings and death upon the cross was so much for Him that it was as if He Himself had suffered and was crucified. But it also has another meaning, that the self-life has died. So he says, I live, yet not I. Not I. The life that Paul is describing involves the death to self. It's the only way we can live connected to Christ. Self has to die. He says, I live. He describes it from the negative. Not I. And then he describes it from the positive. But Christ. In those 4 words. Not I, but Christ. That's a summation of the Christian life. Not I, but Christ. It's a rebuke of removed from Him. So hear him say, not I, but Christ. It's a statement of emphasis. The emphasis is not I, the emphasis is Christ. It's a statement of priority. The priority is not I, the priority is Christ. It is a statement of His purpose in life. My purpose is not I, but Christ. It is a statement that declares His motive and His reason for living. Not I, but Christ. It's a statement regarding His focal point. Not I, but Christ. It's a declaration of the controlling and dominating factor of His life. Not I, but Christ. It's a declaration of His pursuit, His goal, His aim in life. Not I, but Christ. Those 4 words declare the influential force in his life. The influential force of my life, he is saying, is not I, but Christ. We can be sure of this. If I does not take its proper place, life will be lived removed, detached from Christ, rather than connected to Him. I has to be in its proper place. If it's not, there's no Christian life. If I is not put to death, Christ becomes a mere doctrine. rather than a reality in our lives. So if we're going to live the life that Paul sets before us, it must be not I. Not I. It must be a living connection between I and Christ. He's speaking of a life that is synchronized with Christ. Not I, but Christ. It is identity with Christ. Christ is the alternative to I. If it is not I, it has to be something else. There has to be an alternative. And Paul says, that's Christ. He goes on to say, Christ liveth in me. Not I, but Christ liveth in me. Christ in me. But it's not merely Christ in me. It's Christ liveth in me. Quite a difference. Quite a difference. Every child of God has Christ in them. But Paul takes it further. He lives in me. That is, He's not merely in me, He's actively in me. The one whose life upon earth serves as an example and pattern. He lives in me. He's actively engaged in me. The one whose life was pure and holy. He lives in me. He's actively engaged in me. The one who lived his life as the perfect servant of God. Paul says, He lives in me. The one who always did the will of God. He lives in me. He's active in me. The one who always delighted in doing the work of God. He's active in me, Paul is saying. This is a rebuke of removed from Him. The one who lived life in perfect oneness with the Father. He lives in me. The one who lived a life victorious over sin and the world and Satan lives in me. There's a great marvel to those words. Christ liveth in me. It's a life, so Paul is saying, I live a life manifesting the living Christ who's in me. Christ liveth in me. He lives as the ruler and the moving power. It is a life that springs from Christ. Christ liveth in me, driving me, empowering me, guiding me, living His life in and through me. That's Christianity. Christ actively inside. So personal examination is needed concerning the life that I live. How disconnected is it from I? And how connected is it to Christ? That requires honest self-examination. Not sure we're capable of that. Secondly, he describes it as a life lived above the earthly. He said, the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. So Paul, though living in a body of flesh, the life which I now live in the flesh, he lives beyond that. And that's indicated by the words, by faith. Faith is for now, but faith sees beyond now. Faith is not stuck in now. Faith moves beyond now. So we hear Paul say, I now live by faith. I live now, but I do so by faith. That is, I'm not stuck in now. Faith moves me beyond now. How many who profess Christ, they're always stuck in now. Now changes, but whatever the change, that's where they are. Paul says, I live beyond that. It's seen in knowing Christ in the now. It is a life more connected to Christ than the earth. A life that takes us beyond the earthly. Thirdly, it is a life connected to His love for us. Paul, in describing this life, he says, I live, yet not I, but Christ, the Son of God, who loved me. Again, this is more than just a doctrinal truth to Paul. It was personal. He loved me. It was real. We hear Paul say, the Son of God who loved me. This was something that Paul knew. He knew that Christ loved him. People will say, well, I know the Lord loves me. Do you? Because if you really know it, it's going to be manifest in your life. You can't know something like that and it not have an effect upon you. And it not have an impact upon you. The Son of God who loved me. This was something that Paul experienced. It was something that he felt. Paul was living connected and in relation to, he loves me. He loves me. How many will say, the Lord loves me, but they live their life removed from that? He lived persuaded, convinced, and assured that he was personally loved, unconditionally loved by Christ Himself. So he's describing a life feeling the power and the fervency of He loved me. And this is so regardless of now. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me. In other words, now did not diminish the reality of Christ's love to him. No matter what comprised now, it did not overshadow the Son of God who loved me. And notice the emphasis there. The Son of God. That's who Christ is. That makes Him equal with God. He could have said, the Son of God loved me. But that's not what He said. He said, the Son of God who loved me. You see, he sees the amazingness of that. He's the Son of God and He loves me. This has an impact upon our life. So whatever now consists of, he did not lose sight of this truth. Now did not cause him to stop experiencing and feeling the Son of God who loved me. Do we live our lives connected and in relation to Jesus Christ Himself loves me? He goes on, it is a life connected to Christ's sacrifice. He says, the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. That's the manifestation of His love. He gave Himself. He gave Himself for me. So it's a surrendering and sacrificing love. Paul felt the reality of the fact that God, in a body of human flesh, voluntarily leaves the glories of heaven for Him, took His sins upon Himself, and went to the cross and paid the sin debt in full. And now we hear Him say, the Son of God gave Himself for me. So He lives life seeing Jesus on the cross for him. It is also a life connected to the grace of God. And we see that in verse 21. He says, I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if righteousness come by the law, that's what these Judaizers were teaching, then Christ is dead in vain. I do not frustrate the grace of God. It was by God's grace that there was a connection between Him and Christ. It was by God's grace that Christ loved him. It was by God's grace that Christ died in his stead. The phrase, the grace of God, refers to God's favor manifested in salvation. And Paul says, I do not frustrate the grace of God. He's saying, I do not live in such a way that it appears that God's amazing grace and salvation has no influence over me. He says, that's not my life. He's saying the life that I live manifests God's grace toward me. The life that I live manifests that I am saved. And I live connected and in relation to the fact of God's saving grace. And that's how we need to live. We need to live our lives in the reality of, I'm saved. And He saved me. And that's what Paul is saying here. Again, it's all a rebuke to removed from Christ. We must always guard against. Again, I'm not talking about a denial of Christ. You can profess Christ and yet be removed from Him. You can profess Christ and be separated from Him in your manner of living. We're not talking about a denial of Christ, but moved from Him. And the life that Paul describes here is a rebuke of that. The life which I now live. Which I now live in the flesh, in my mortal body. We need to always examine that. The life which I now live. We're all living, and we're all living now. And we're all living in a particular way now. And it's either removed from Christ or connected to Christ. But regardless of now, Galatians 2 verse 20 is the life that we're to live. It's the life we can live. Regardless of now, you can live this life. Well, the way things are, I'm just not able to do it now. That's not so. That's not so. That's a lie you've told yourself. It's not so. This is the life as a child of God you can live now. Our now's in a constant flux of change. Tomorrow will be a different now. A second from now is a different now. It's in a constant flux of change. But there is a life for Christ now. And that doesn't change. Not I, but Christ. It's a life not being shaped by earth, but by Christ. What shapes our life? A life far greater and more meaningful than the form and shadow of mere religion. A life above and beyond mental assent to a system of belief. So let's close by reading Galatians 2:20 again. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Let that define our life. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us.